Hello there, listening squirrels. As much as I love the book, we're back to Kindle because I couldn't see it. So we're on whatever chapter we're on. 4. Is it 4? Yes, it's 4. 4. And we are on the second part of chapter 4. It's got them divided into parts. The last sentence I read was, 2 days later, Lucy left London en route for Rutherford Hall. I can see it. Driving her own small car, Lucy Islesbarrow drove through an imposing pair of vast iron gates. Just inside them was what had originally been a small lodge, which now seemed completely derelict. Whether through war damage or merely through neglect, it was difficult to be sure. A long winding drive led through large, gloomy clumps of rhododendrons up to the house. Lucy caught her breath in a slight gasp when she saw the house, which was a kind of miniature Windsor castle. The stone steps in front of the door could have done with attention, and the gravel sweep was green with neglected weeds. She pulled an old-fashioned wrought iron bell, and its clamor sounded echoing away inside. A slatternly woman, wiping her hands on her apron, opened the door and looked at her suspiciously. "Expected, aren't you?" she said. "Miss something Barrow, she told me." "Quite right," said Lucy. The house was desperately cold inside. Her guide led her along a dark hall and opened a door on the right. Rather to Lucy's surprise, it was quite a pleasant sitting room, with books and chintz-covered chairs. Chintz. I'll tell her," said the woman, and went away, shutting the door after having given Lucy a look of profound disfavor. After a few minutes the door opened again. From the first moment Lucy decided that she liked Emma Crackenthorpe. She was a middle-aged woman with no very outstanding characteristics, neither good-looking nor plain, sensibly dressed in tweeds and pullover, with dark hair swept back from her forehead, steady hazel eyes, and a very pleasant voice. She said, "Miss Islesbarrow?" and held out her hand. Then she looked doubtful. "I wonder," she said, "if this post is really what you're looking for. I don't want a housekeeper, to supervise things. I want someone to do the work." Lucy said that was what most people needed. Emma Crackenthorpe said apologetically, "So many people, seem to think that just a little light dusting will answer the case, but I can do all the light dusting myself." "I quite understand," said Lucy. "You want cooking and washing up and housework and stoking the boiler. That's all right. That's what I do. I'm not at all afraid of work. It's a big house, I'm afraid, and inconvenient. Of course, we only live in a portion of it, my father and myself, that is. He's rather an invalid. We live quite quietly, and there is an AGA stove. I have several brothers, but they're not here very often. 2 women come in, a Mrs. Kidder in the morning and Mrs. Hart 3 days a week to do brasses and things like that." "You have your own car?" "Yes, it can stand out in the open if there's nowhere to put it. It's used to it. Oh, there are any amount of old stables. There's no trouble about that." She frowned a moment and then said, "Islesbarrow. Rather an unusual name. Some friends of mine were telling me about a Lucy Islesbarrow. The Kennedys?" "Yes, I was with them in North Devon when Mrs. Kennedy was having a baby." Emma Crackenthorpe smiled. "I know they said they'd never had such a wonderful time as when you were there seeing to everything. But I had the idea that you were terribly expensive. The sum I mentioned, that's quite all right, said Lucy. I want particularly, you see, to be near Brackhampton. I have an elderly aunt in a critical state of health, and I want to be within easy distance of her. That's why the salary is a secondary consideration. I can't afford to do nothing if I could be sure of having some time off most days. Oh, of course, every afternoon till 6, if you like. That seems perfect. Mrs. Crackenthorpe hesitated a moment before saying, my father is elderly and a little difficult sometimes. He's very keen on economy, and he says things sometimes that upset people. I wouldn't like, Lucy broke in quickly. I'm quite used to elderly people of all kinds, she said. I always managed to get on well with them. Emma Crackenthorpe looked relieved. Isn't this so much better? Trouble with father, diagnosed Lucy. I bet he's an old tartar. She was apportioned a large gloomy bedroom with a small electric heater do its inadequate best to warm, and was shown round the house, a vast and comfortable mansion. As they paused a door in the hall, a voice roared out, "That you, Emma? You got that new girl there? Bring her in. I want to look at her." Emma flushed, glanced at Lucy apologetically. The two women entered the room. It was richly upholstered in dark velvet. The narrow windows let in very little light, and it was full of heavy mahogany Victorian furniture. Old Mr. Crackenthorpe was stretched out in an invalid chair, a silver-headed stick by his side. He was a big, gaunt man, his flesh hanging in loose folds. He had a face rather like a bulldog, with a pugnacious chin. He had thick, dark hair flecked with gray and small, suspicious eyes. "Let's have a look at you, young lady." Lucy advanced, composing and smiling. "There's just one thing you'd better understand straight away. Just because we live in a big house doesn't mean we're rich. We're not rich. We live simply, do you hear? Simply. No good coming here with a lot of highfalutin ideas. Cod's as good a fish as turbot, Turbot, any day, and don't you forget it. I don't stand for waste. I live here because my father built the house, and I like it. After I'm dead, they can sell it up if they want to, and I expect they will want to. No sense of family. This house is well built. It's solid, and we've got our own land around us. Keeps us private. It would bring in a lot if sold for building land, but not while I'm alive. You won't get me out of here until you take me out feet first." He glared at Lucy. "Your home is your castle," said Lucy, laughing at me. "Of course not. I think it's very exciting to have a real country place all surrounded by town." "Quite so. Can't see another house from here, can you? Fields with cows in them, right in the middle of Brackhampton. You hear the traffic a bit when the winds blow that way, but otherwise it's still country." He added, without pause or change of tone, to his daughter, "Ring up that damn fool of a doctor. Tell him that last medicine's no good at all." Lucy and Emma retired. He shouted after them. "And don't let that damned woman who sniffs dust in here. She's disarranged all my books." Lucy asked, "Has Mr. Crackenthorpe been an invalid long?" Emma said rather evasively, "Oh, for years now. This is the kitchen. The kitchen was enormous. A vast kitchen range stood cold and neglected, and Aga stood demurely beside it. Lucy asked times of meals and inspected the larder. Then she said cheerfully to Emma Crackenthorpe, "I know everything now. Don't bother. Leave it all to me." Emma Crackenthorpe heaved a sigh of relief as she went to her bed that night. "The Kennedys were quite right," she said. "She's wonderful." Lucy rose at 6 the next morning. She did the house, prepared vegetables, assembled, cooked, and served breakfast with Mrs. Kidder. She made the beds, and at 11 o'clock they sat down to strong tea and biscuits in the kitchen, mollified by the fact that Lucy had no airs about her, and also by the strength and weakness of the tea. Mrs. Kidder relaxed into gossip. She was a small, spare woman with a sharp eye and tight lips. "Regular old skinflint he is. What she has to do with... What she has to put up with. All the same, she's not what I call downtrodden. Can hold her own all right when she has to. When the gentlemen come down, she sees to it there's something decent to eat." The gentlemen? Yes, big family it was. The eldest, Mr. Edmund, he was killed in the war. Then there's Mr. Cedric. He lives abroad somewhere. He's not married. Paints pictures in foreign parts. Mr. Harold's in the city, lives in a cave. Wait a minute. In the city, you can live in a cave. Lives in London. Married an earl's daughter. Then there's Mr. Alfred. He's got a nice way with him, but he's a bit of a black sheep. Been in trouble once or twice. And there's Miss Edith's husband, Mr. Bryan. Ever so nice he is. She died some years ago, but he's always stayed one of the family. And there's Master Alexander, Miss Edith's little boy. He's at school, comes here for part of the holidays, always. Miss Emma's terribly set on him. Lucy digested all the information, continuing to press tea on her informant. Finally, reluctantly, Miss Kidder rose to her feet. Seemed to have got along a treat we do this morning, she said wonderingly. "Want me to give you a hand with the potatoes, dear?" "They're all done already." "Well, you are one for getting on with things. I might as well be getting along myself, as there doesn't seem anything else to do." Mrs. Kidder departed, and Lucy, with all the time on her hands, scrubbed the kitchen table, which she had been longing to do, but which she had put off so as not to offend Mrs. Kidder, whose job it properly was. Then she cleaned the silver till it shone radiantly. She cooked lunch, cleared it away, washed it up, and at 2:30 was ready to start exploration. She had set out the tea things ready on a tray with sandwiches and bread and butter covered with a damp napkin to keep them moist. She strolled round the gardens, which would be the normal thing to do. The kitchen garden was sketchily cultivated with a few vegetables. The hot houses were in ruins. The paths everywhere were grown with weeds. A herbaceous border near the house was the only thing that showed free of weeds and in good condition, and Lucy suspected that had been Emma's hand. The gardener was a very old man, somewhat deaf, but who was making a showing of work. Showing of work. Show of working. Lucy spoke to him pleasantly. He lived in a cottage adjacent to the big stable yard. Leading out of the stable yard, a back drive led through the park, which was fenced off on either side of it and under a railway arch into a small back lane. Every few minutes a train thundered along the main line over the railway arch. Lucy watched the trains as they sharpened. Hang on. Slackened speed going round the sharp curve that encircled the Crackenthorpe property. She passed under the railway arch and out into the lane. It seemed a little-used track. On the one side was the railway embankment. On the other side was a high wall which enclosed some tall factory buildings. Lucy followed the lane until it came out into a street of small houses. She could hear a short distance away the busy hum of main road traffic. She glanced at her watch. A woman came out of the house nearby, and Lucy stopped her. "Excuse me, can you tell if there's a public telephone near here?" "Post office, just at the corner of the road." Lucy thanked her and walked along until she came to the post office, which was a combination shop and post office. There was a telephone box at one side. Lucy went into it and made a call. She asked to speak to Miss Marple. A woman's voice spoke in a sharp bark. "She's resting, and I'm not going to disturb her. She needs her rest." "She's an old lady. Who shall I say called?" Miss Owlsbarrow. "There's no need to disturb her. Just tell her that I've arrived and everything is going on well, and that I'll let her know when I've got any news." She replaced the receiver and made her way back to Rutherford Hall. That's it. It's just because I'm sleepy again, y'all. And I hadn't even been taking my pain pills till I just can't stand it, so I won't be sleepy. I think I need a B12 every day. I gotta pack up all my. I'm working on rags today and tomorrow, but then I gotta get pack-a-lacking. Leaving out Friday morning. Don't forget, I can't think of who comes on tonight, but Triple C comes on with Making Meat tomorrow, and if Hannah's not here, I'll pop on her Making Meat. I may even, if Hannah's here, because she'll just get on her computer and do whatever. Love y'all. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.